right, everyone. Hello, welcome back to Dan's Astrology. I'm your host, Dan. Today, as I'm recording this, it's Friday, May the 9th, and I'm going to do something a bit different today. I'm recording a video for a full moon in Scorpio, and the only reason why this is atypical is that I have developed a habit or a certain style in approaching this astrology channel to not do lunation videos. Although I guess the thing is, I do eclipse videos, which are lunations, but I've noticed that other popular astrologers may actually just focus specifically on lunation videos, or use that as a kind of a schedule, like they're going to do like maybe a bi-monthly, right? Because like and I think I'm gonna there's something about the lunations which are roughly on a monthly basis that provide kind of like anchoring into a regular schedule of astrology videos. And there's something about my reasoning of before I get into this particular lunation, I'm going to explain to you why I decided not to do this, basically, right? Is that I have been focusing on my channel more on planetary aspects. And if you take basically the rationale behind what you might describe as the Hermetic tradition of astrology, is that everything that takes place here on Earth, in our everyday life, in our world, happens in what we would describe as the sublunar realm, okay? And the practice of astrology is a contemplation upon the archetypal patterns that exist in the cosmos and that take us beyond the sublunar realm into the levels of the heavenly spheres, basically, right? And in order to do this, in order to create a refined kind of contemplation of the higher spheres as represented by the planetary archetypes, that is basically going beyond the sublunar realm into the heavens, right? And by creating an astrology channel that is focused primarily on the lunations, which is, let's say, the new moon and the full moon, what you're doing is you're making content that is appealing to an audience who are, maybe barely able to get beyond the sublunar realm, right? Like you're basically having a group of people who are, in that respect, archetypally unconscious, because the archetype of the moon is essentially one side of the moon is shown, one side of the moon is hidden, and it's always fluctuating, right? It's always in these phases of transition and all this kind of stuff. And, I mean, if you want, I'm not saying, it is, of course, a very important influence in astrology, but to the extent that you are focusing on the moon and the moon's monthly cycle, you are keeping the conversation locked in that thing, and maybe you have the opportunity, for example, to talk about the rulers of Scorpio, the traditional ruler being Mars. Some modern people use Pluto. We just had a Mars-Pluto opposition that this full moon is going to be squaring, and you could try to kind of bring that in. But the thing is, because Mars is, archetypally maladjusted to the moon, right? In the sense that in the moon in Scorpio, Mars, the night sign of Mars, is the place where the moon does not do well. That characterizes this full moon, right? To understand those, if you want to bring into a more mature or more developed conversation about the lunate, other than just like, oh, now's the time to bring something to fruition or let go of what no longer serves you. If you actually want to get into the archetypes, you have to move beyond the sublunar realm through these higher spheres. And when you start hitting the malefics, such as Mars and Saturn, you get into all sorts of things which are could bring up all kinds of fear and aversion because they're malefic. There's a certain style of astrology that tries to make everything nice or make everything good because those are all just palette. This is your color palette of the paints you're painting with and stuff like that. And it doesn't necessarily have to be cause for alarm or cause for bad things or whatever. But once you start moving into the more that you're locked in on the sublunar realm, the more you're basically playing it at the level of attachment, right? Attachment to, or sentimentality, or hope and fear, or investing in some kind of an outcome or something like that. And then when you move beyond that into the realm of the aspects, you can see that there are these patterns that are playing out, that, especially with things like, if you have a lot of investment in the themes of like scarcity versus abundance or something like that, and then you get we're going to be getting squares between Saturn and Jupiter. We get tensions between them. Oh, then you're going to get pulled out of that because your attachment, I just want to grow and develop. I don't want to be, I don't want to have austerity or stingy attitude or deal with scarcity or something like that, right? All of those archetypes are going to pull you out the more you are invested at the level of gain and loss, right? Winning and losing. You're gambling on the stock market or the horse race or something, and there's this sort of the roll of the dice, and you don't know how it's going to turn out or something, right? So I tend to basically just see there's a certain thing, though, that if you keep it at that lunar level, it does give you this sort of anchoring into a regular cycle. And actually, there's certain things about this which I think people do not realize, even if you don't believe in astrology, how much astrology informs our system of timekeeping. Because even if you don't believe so much about full moon cycles and stuff like that, you're still using a monthly calendar system, and that I think most people may not recognize that the word month actually has the word moon in it, right? A month is actually a month, right? So that by keeping a monthly calendar, it means that we are planning our whole monthly, our whole system of paying rent, of paying the bills, all this kind of stuff by this moon thing, which is controlling our whole system of attachment, right? Controlling our whole system of things we have to do on a monthly basis, bills we have to pay, responsibilities, attachment to different cycles of gain and loss, all this kind of stuff, which is part of what goes on in astrology. But the more the more you focus on the moon, the more you're playing it at the level of attachment, right? And that basically just obscures your ability to see the other things, and especially when we start getting into the modern planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. The whole idea of the modern outer planets are that these are archetypes that require a finer, more refined sensibility to approach and deal with, because if you are at this new moon, full moon level of doing and there's certain interesting things about this, which is, one thing is that if you listen to people who are skeptics of astrology, they will criticize astrology because they see it as being basically one-dimensional, because if you're creating a personality profile for something, all they understand about it is that you take a person's birth date, you take one piece of information, which is actually two pieces of information because you need their location. But okay, you take one piece of information at a certain time, right? and from that and then they're like, oh, so it's just your birthday, so you just have this one, you're either this, you're this one thing, but then you're like, no, because then it's like you're not seeing all the different planets, right? You take one time, you have a position for 7 traditional things, right? But the thing is, most people, they can't even get to the past the moon, let alone seeing all these different layers of different things going on, right? Because also all they can think of is like where, like what day it is, where this, and I don't know. Maybe this is a bit of a tangent, right? But I'm trying to say that there's you have, in order to approach the finer subtleties, you can't just spend all your time hung up on this moon stuff, right? So with that in mind, I'm going to. One of the reasons why I'm deciding to do full moon videos, going into the lunations, is because, well, basically, I was sketching out some ideas in my notebook, not even thinking particularly about doing astrology videos, and then I noticed that what I was writing about seemed to work particularly well with the themes around a full moon in Scorpio, with these aspects going on to Mars and Pluto. And you can keep in mind they're whole sign aspects. They're not, they're not maybe like, it's like, it could be worse if the moon was more tightly configured. So we got a bit of wiggle room, but there's something about the aspect, like the full moon in Scorpio, if you consider what I was saying earlier about the moon having to do a lot with attachment and gain and loss and insecurity, all that keeps us more maybe occluded or blind to the more sensitive levels of perception. There's something about all of this which feels like Scorpio has to do with this sort of like fear, or this process of death, or this process of elimination, right? And for example, we just had, it was just announced recently, a new pope. A pope has passed away, so there's a kind of a regenerative process with this, like if you can think about like the Scorpio season being in the fall, or that there's a sort of duality where we're in the spring, where we're having the springtime seasonal thing happen, but then the full moon offers the counter position of being reflecting in the other part of the sky that has to do with the other seasonal thing, right? And that there's some sort of like, I'm thinking about the Pope thing right now for a number of reasons, that I think one of the things about that I noticed is that there has been a recent trend in the post-COVID years where there's more of an increase towards participation in traditional religion, things like that. And for example, I mean, actually, I haven't watched the whole thing, but the most recent Horseshoe Theory podcast, this guy JREG interviewed his parents, and I was just at the very beginning. It was started out with his mother talking about how religious she is, about how she wakes up at 3 a.m. Because she can't sleep. Like, I actually relate to this because I have a thing going on where I find it difficult to sleep in. I usually wake up fairly early, but I'm not Christian, and I don't know if I have the same relation to prayer, but I think there's something kind of odd about I think that there could be some kind of dynamic where, if you consider the fact that we're living in a post-COVID era, and there's also a lot of uncertainty around the second Trump presidency, where there's been a kind of economic stock market crash, or the idea of maybe he's doing it on purpose, planning to crash the American dollar for the sake of his trade whatever plan or whatever. We're in this kind of time of uncertainty, where if the more that you're invested into gain and loss and winning and losing, or attachment into a certain outcome, the more that you're looking for something more stronger foundation to ground yourself to, right? And I think that there's something about the this full moon in Scorpio, which could like highlight this. There's a certain kind of like uneasiness to the situation, and there's I'm kind of approaching some sort of issue here because I have my own kind of like interest in, like, I don't know, reading Carl Jung, or interest in maybe religious or mystical themes or something like that. But it reminds me that there was a guy named Krishnamurti who was actually selected by the Theosophists to be a great teacher, but he rejected all of that, right? And one of the things that Krishnamurti said was that he rejected the whole idea of organized religion. He rejected the whole idea of the need to form groups or collective organizations, because he basically said that it was basically like a fear response, right? It's basically, so actually, something kind of interesting about it was it's actually kind of Nietzschean if you think about it, because Nietzsche criticized the Christians for a herd morality, right? Or that the whole image of Jesus, the Messiah, as a shepherd looking after his flock or something like that. It's like a bunch of scared herd animals herding together for the sake of safety, to provide like some sort of thing is going to be your daddy, is going to provide you with some sort of sense of safety and security in time of great chaos and uncertainty and upheaval and something like that. So no wonder when there's a time of economic crash, or there's a time of pestilence and disease or outbreak of different natural disasters and stuff like that, that in the midst of when the natural world, when our environment and when our communities are fragmented and chaotic and disrupted, that people have some sort of drive for some sort of like transcendent thing that's going to be stable when everything else isn't stable, right? And I think that kind of that impulse is sort of this is part of the reason why I tend not to do full moon videos, is that impulse is the same impulse to go beyond the level of the sublunar realm of gain and loss and coming and going and arrivals and departures and all this kind of stuff, to some sort of transcendent truth that's there regardless. And I think that this is kind of like when all these, as you keep going further past Saturn to Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, that's kind of what you start to get into. And perhaps another thing to consider is that the Uranus is in Taurus. Uranus is going to be making an ingress into Gemini pretty soon, but we got a bunch of other ingresses coming up to deal with first. But this Uranus opposition to the full moon could kind of go with this sort of rebellious kind of impulse to not go with the herd or something. Although it's kind of there's a certain agrarian mentality to Taurus, right? Or this idea to foresight, right? Like the archetype of Uranus is often associated with Prometheus and foresight, to know better, to be able to see what's coming, to be able to plan for it rationally, and to not give into just being a blind herd animal that that has to group together. And for also this reason, one of the reasons why if you think about this whole thing, like if you want to create a popular astrology channel, there's certain formulas which may help provide success in terms of numbers, like full moon videos might do better than going on into the minutia of different little micro aspects and stuff like that. But this is basically the same basic fear of scarcity, right? That like if the Marshall McLuhan made this argument that the power of a number is directly related to counting an army, right? To say that if I've got big numbers on my astrology channel, it's supposed to provide me with a sense of security, in the sense as if all my followers who are following me on my channel were like my gang of soldiers that I would like. I'm protected because I have all these followers to keep me safe due to the exit. And it's kind of funny because in our in the current political regime, there's a suggestion of like an existential threat. Curiously enough, not from environmental problems like global warming or the climate crisis or anything like that, or of lack of access to healthcare, or different diseases or viral epidemics or something like that. But there's this like the most explicitly communicated existential threat is really just the threat to our national sovereignty as Canadians. But we recently just had a meeting where our newly elected Prime Minister, Mark Carney, met with Trump, and he seemed to reinforce the idea that Canada is not for sale and that we are not going to be going in that direction. But there's some kind of like, there's the basic, like the existential threat is not one of immediate scarcity or lack, but rather economic violence, which is kind of curious if you consider that, like, I don't know. I mean, the whole problem with economic violence is, like, people are going to suffer because they have to pay more at the till for certain items or whatever, or, like, coffee is going to, like, gets more expensive or something, and people are a little bit more stressed. Like, this doesn't translate to me as, like, a real existential threat. But there's a certain kind of like the uncertainty where you go to the grocery store and you don't know what price things are going to be, right? Or that there could be that, maybe if you are a business owner, under the pressures of the economy, you may be pressured into selling your business to some sort of multinational conglomerate, right? Or something like that. Which brings me to some other thing that was on my mind, which, I mean, I don't know how many people watching my channel are invested in this like I am, or are interested in this, but I have to admit, I'm a synthesizer enthusiast. I have a small collection of synthesizers, and my newsfeed recently has been completely clogged up with the announcement of new synthesizers from Moog, a company that, it's almost like the Kleenex brand of synthesizers, right? Like the way that if you would say to somebody, if you need to blow your nose, can you pass me a Kleenex? And that's the name brand for a tissue. Like, who says, can you pass me a facial tissue? Nobody. Everybody says, pass me a Kleenex. Or I don't know if people still say that anymore. Maybe this is out of date. Maybe but I grew up when or Windex, right? If you want to clean your window, you don't say, please pass me the window cleaner. You say, pass me the Windex, right? In that same attitude, a Moog, for a lot of musicians, a Moog was synonymous with synthesizer. There was, like, saying the word synthesizer was kind of awkward, but you said a Moog, people knew what you were talking about, right? And Moog was named after the guy Bob Moog, who started the company, and he had certain contemporaries such as Dave Smith, who did the Sequential Prophets and all this kind of stuff. Dave Smith passed away. I think Bob Moog passed away. There's probably some issue where they used to have a American-owned, American-made kind of boutique factory where the Moog brand was still going, and you still had people designing and building synthesizers in this almost like a kind of a mom and pop shop format. But what's really kind of strange is that recently Moog has been bought out by a conglomerate called inMusic that there's a bunch of, I'll go show you something here. Okay, this is funny because this also goes with this Uranus. This full moon is opposed by Uranus in Taurus, and Uranus in Taurus is almost going at the very end of Taurus to move into what sign? Gemini. This is a box that I have for a Gemini CD player from the Y2K era. This is before CDJs turned into what they are known to look like today. I don't think I have this CD player anymore. I think I sold it, but I sold the box. There's all this. You don't see any brands stuff from this brand Gemini anymore. I also had a mixer from this company called Newmark. And there's also all these little brands like Denon and stuff. Basically, people make these companies, and eventually it becomes the business goes broke or bankrupt, and they just sell off to some bigger conglomerate that then owns all of these brand names to use. But it's like basically like a brand graveyard, basically, right? And I was thinking about this, being that it's kind of, there's this eerie feeling that this company Moog is now entered into the brand graveyard and is continuing to produce Moog synthesizers, but it's fairly obvious that these are not actually, it's not the same Moog that it used to be, right? And they actually, it looks like a lot like the new one that got announced looks a lot like a Novation Base Station 2, but has just a different name. Or it looks like somebody took a Novation Base Station, combined it with a Korg mini log, and then slapped Moog on the front of it. And then I got thinking about this, and it reminded me of a movie that I have on Blu-ray that I rewatched recently called Annihilation, directed by Alex Garland. And I have to admit that Annihilation is also, there's a series of sci-fi novels, right? I haven't read the books. I've only watched the movie, but I like them. I don't know. Maybe I should read. Leave me a comment if you think that the books are worth reading or not. Should I read the Annihilation novels? I like to, if you've read them, I'd like to hear your reviews. But for now, I've only seen the movie. I like the movie because, in terms of a science fiction thriller, it just does, it fits. If I feel like watching a science fiction thriller movie, it fills that need. It scratches that itch. It does what I want a science fiction movie to do, right? And one of the basically, I mean, if you haven't seen it, I'm going to spoil it for you or whatever a little bit. So heads up about that. But one of the themes of Annihilation is that it's similar kind of to like Stalker by Tarkovsky, where there's like this zone. But in the Annihilation film, the zone is like a meteorite had hit this area, and this whole zone had been quarantined, sectioned off. And then when you go into the zone, it seems to be like your DNA molecules or your DNA or something like that starts to get scrambled with other stuff, and then people start mutating in weird ways where people start like turning into plants, or people start turning, like the animals start mutating with each other. And it's like this idea that if this is this theme started to remind me of the Pluto archetype, in the sense that if I think about the Pluto, I think about like, imagine if you had like, you know in Toy Story, the movie Toy Story, how you had like the guy who like took apart all the toys and made these weird monster toys out of like by mixing and matching the toy parts, right? It's like that kind of like, if you had that kind of mentality, if you had a whole bunch of like scrap doll parts and like mixed and matched them so that they're like none of the things had an essential, like a basic essence, right? Like the idea that if you had like the Toy Story characters, you have Woody and you have Buzz Lightyear or whatever as like essential characters, but then in the Pluto underworld, it's all just like a scrap heap where you could like have all that your head taken off and put on some other body and mix and mist. And there's something about the Pluto archetype and the underworld of Pluto that goes with that, right? And I think that there's something about this new, like what happens when you have a brand that is like a mom and pop shop brand, and this also happens with stuff like organic products. Like I hear a lot of people complain about Bragg's apple cider vinegar, that Bragg's apple cider vinegar used to be really good, and then the family that owned it passed away, the original people, and then they sold it to a big brand, and then now the big brand sells a substandard version of apple cider vinegar or a substandard version of soy sauce or whatever it is, right? Like all this, like, so there's certain, it happens to all these big brands, right? But there's some sort of weird feeling that there's some, like, there's now a brand, the new Moog brand is like, at first they're kind of wearing it on their sleeve because they had another one called the Moog Muse, which was like, Muse as in taking inspiration from the real dude, Bob Moog, and the real brand. It's just inspiration for us to do something other thing with it, right? And that, like, or that this idea that, like, but we're still going to use the brand name, or there's this kind of thing, there's like this feeling that what is presenting itself to you is not the authentic thing, but just something that was inspired by the spirit of something that used to be there, which is not around anymore, right? It's like a ghost, right? That is not, it's no longer the thing itself. It's just this vague inspiration of what came before, right? But then if you actually get into the details of what is there, what you start to see is you're like, oh, it's like, it looks like some strange cannibalized thing where you just took a bunch of other popular things and then just mixed and matched ideas that worked from one thing to the other thing and then put them together in this weird cannibalized Frankenstein monster of a thing, and then slapped the popular brand name on it, and then they try to sell that to you. But when you actually look at the ideas themselves, they're not actually using any new ideas. They're just recycling stuff that was from 10 years ago, right? And I think there's something about, like, this is like there's a certain kind of discontentment I feel around this, that I feel like it's equivalent to being like the dog who's like digging up old bones in the graveyard and is like chewing at the bone, trying to get whatever last like little bits of marrow of sustenance. But it's actually like the bone, like the bone had more sustenance in it 10 years ago when people were making, like, it's like now it's like getting a copy of a copy of a copy. There's or Nine Inch Nails song like that, right? An infinitely recycled, regurgitated thing that's just a vague inspiration of some original idea that came before it, right? And it obviously, I don't know, but to me, it's pretty uninspiring, right? But there's something about this which is a kind of there's if you look at it within the cycle of the archetype of astrology, you have in the lunar archetype, you have the moon spends half of its time waxing, the other half of its time waning, right? You have the seasons have this sort of like seasonal peaks with the summer solstice, and then the fall into the winter and stuff like this, and this whole pattern of gain and loss and composition and decomposition, right? There's something highlighted in all of this, I feel, as a moment of decomposition emphasized by the full moon in Scorpio, right? And that the more that we are invested in sentimentality and nostalgia and basic attachments, the more that we might be pulled out by the fear and uncertainty and insecurity, and that we turn to something like mass organized religion to be a kind of an opiate for the masses, right? That we don't have any practical idea about how to, like, actually, if you look at basic security in terms of, true, we have a housing crisis, but like in terms of, like, and food might be more expensive, but it's like there's something about all this which is really just blatantly absurd to me, because it's like and I have to admit that, I'm a white dude, and identity politics comes into play, because if you talk to other people who are from other cultures who may have actually had to deal with real poverty, real scarcity, real problems, it's like, what's exactly the issue, right? Right now, like, if anybody who needs to eat food is going to be able to find food where they want it, you know, or like, you know what I'm trying to say? Like, it's not, we're not really at this point where anybody has to worry about starving or like going like, or there's like, there may be in the highly competitive, expensive housing market, right? We may have an issue perhaps around, you know, lack of houses, right? But we don't have any issue around lack of food or lack of clothing or lack of resources. We're actually living in a fairly affluent and abundant society, and the only real existential threat is this vague, you know, this economic violence, which in itself isn't actually like this. It has like, as long as the goddamn Coca-Cola is still flowing, and you can just load up on your fucking Diet Coke and your Pepsi and your fried chicken, like you're not in this point where you are like a poor impoverished person in another country who has to scrape out the last grain of rice and is like actually facing an existential threat, right? So we have this really vague sense of like, oh, we're gonna make the global casino where everybody's just like, we have all this money that's in a stock market, which is all just speculative, and we're all just living high on the hog, gambling our money, getting rich without working, and like the only scarcity is just like, oh, wait a minute, I don't know if I can bet on this stupid fucking like gambling stock market kind of economy the same way that I used to, right? That's basically it. And then that is apparently our existential, or that we are, for some reason that we're like I was walking my dog the other day, and I walked past some random couple, and then the guy was trying to tell his wife about like gambling, like, oh yeah, you can make all this money, and then like, oh my god, this is like, it could be some guy who's like you've like, what's this guy? I don't know what this guy's situation in, but when you just pass a situation like that, you're like, you're probably a person who's, you know, you're probably doing pretty well for yourself. But you're gonna like you're going to gamble all your money away on some risky bullshit, and it's like, could just be self-destructive or something, right? And that like, we actually live in a fair, like, there's something about like, you know, I think that there's something to be said for these really basic kind of new age like gratitude practices, where instead of feeding this sort of like hungry demon that was like, oh, maybe I can go gamble all my money and like I can get rich or something, that you're just like, you know, even at the bare minimum, we live in a fairly abundant, affluent society that if it becomes this problem where people's biggest existential threat is their own bad habits, their own self-destructive tendencies, right? And why this kind of brings me back to some other issue, which I have to say, you know, unfortunately, I don't know how well this is, like, there's a certain thing where there's like, if you're doing YouTube videos, you know, there's all these kind of things about like playing the game of popularity, right? That if I choose to focus not in doing full moon videos or lunation videos, if I try to focus on more fine details of the aspects, I may not get as many views, right? So then if I do make a full moon video where I'm going to be getting lots more views, lots more attention, because this tends to be what people click on more, maybe I'm going to, what if the same way that this husband is going to gamble all his money away at the casino or something, or like lose it all on Bitcoin or whatever it might be, like what if I set it up? It would be like, oh, I'm going to have a full moon video that I'm going to get so much more popularity, and then I'm going to sabotage it, because there's a certain, like, if you start using, there's this whole culture right now where you can't use the word suicide, you have to say unaliving. Well, I already said it, I fucked it up. I just self-sabotaged my whole video, right? But why I'm bringing up that the topic of suicide and self-destruction is that there's a great quote in the movie Annihilation about it that I'm going to read to you now. So this is from the movie Annihilation. Why did my husband volunteer for a suicide mission? Is that what you think we're doing? Committing suicide? Well, you must have profiled him. You must have assessed him. He must have said something. So you're asking me as a psychologist? Yeah. Then as a psychologist, I think you're confusing suicide with self-destruction. Almost none of us commit suicide, and almost all of us self-destruct. In some way, in some part of our lives, we drink, we smoke, we destabilize the good job, the happy marriage. But these aren't decisions, they're impulses. In fact, you're probably better equipped to explain this than I am. What does that mean? You're a biologist. Isn't self-destruction coded into us, programmed into each cell? So this is basically like playing off this idea that, well, it's also kind of funny because there's this sort of like, with this Mars-Pluto thing, and Pluto in Aquarius, there's a certain note there about the transhumanism, the transhumanists, which transhumanism can mean a lot of different things. One particular thing it means is these people who want to become immortal, or the people who want to extend their life to inhuman extents, right? And that people who are like, they're going to solve their problem about the fear of death by making death obsolete, and then they'll just live forever or something like that. But there's this idea that, like, in the sense that in the way that self-destruction is actually coded into the body, that it's actually part of the biological program that our body is, we're biologically programmed to reproduce, and we're also biologically programmed to self-destruct, right? There's something interesting influence about this movie Annihilation. Was when I first saw it, was when around the time leading up to moving to Nanaimo, and the house that I rented, it's like, it was kind of funny because it was like this one guy who owned the house and his group of friends. I don't, this is kind of the thing, relationship you have with people you rent from, right? It's not like, I don't know if I'd want to hang out with these people or be friends with them because they seemed kind of self-destructive, right? But then there's something about the choice of watching this movie Annihilation and this kind of admission to self-destruction, right? Or that there's a certain attitude where there's all these people who live flawed, imperfect lives, but that's because there's some sort of self-destructive process playing out that people wouldn't be able to consciously identify with, right? Because there could be like some guy, imagine you have it all. You've got the good job, you've got the wife, you've got the marriage, and you're like, wow, like, why don't we just fucking gamble? Or like, it's like, you're like, you kind of like, you've achieved your position of like, I've made it, I'm successful. But fuck this, I don't want it. I want to just destroy it now, right? I feel like there's like that kind of impulse is like, we're kind of in this process of like late stage capitalism where it's like, we can't, like, we went through this whole thing after World War II with the baby boomers and all that, where there was this huge massive period of growth of industry, of population, of technology, of consumer markets, all that stuff. And that wave is kind of cresting, but like, we can't identify with the will to tone it down, or the will to just sort of scale things back, or or because that would make us a beta male or something, right? That would make us a pussy if we did that. So we just have to be like the most like unconsciously self-destructive. And I think that I mean, I don't know, it should be like, I feel like it's almost redundant to point this out. I'm spending all this time expressing this, but I mean, it should just be like, if you were at least, people should be able to just, be able to connect the dots themselves without having to rely on me doing this for you, right? I would hope so anyways, right? So, but there's that, I think that's part of the issue about, like, with Carl Jung would call this like shadow projection, right? Where because you can't own that part that has that, what you might call the death drive or something like that. It's got so funny because like the Jungian psyche thing is that, like, I think that there's certain repression even of the language around it. The fact that I have to, like, if I'm making this video, I'm going to be like, okay, so I'm going to make, by you including the word suicide, I'm self-sabotaging myself, because even the whole using that word in a conversation is now going to, well, I mean, I'm not even monetized in the first place, but I'm setting myself up so I cannot be monetized, right? I'm basically setting my channel up for failure, because the whole will to self-destruction has to be omitted, because we can't be conscious of it. We can't actually consciously identify with the will to self-destruction. So we have to, in order to ensure that this is entirely unconscious, you're not even allowed to use the word suicide. You're not even allowed to use it, because if you use that, then you are intentionally sabotaging yourself so you can't succeed. And then if you can't succeed, that means, oh my God, you know what? My business isn't going to grow. And if I can't grow, then my business isn't going to grow. Like, oh my God, I'm going to be living in a world of scarcity. I'm going to be living in poverty. Oh my God, right? How am I going to afford a house when there's no fucking houses to, like, how am I going to fucking survive? How on earth are we all going to survive? We better fucking, so you see what's I also find really funny is that in, the evolutionary astrology, that the spiritual evolution is actually defined in a completely separate way from the evolution of natural selection, which is like the evolution of survival, right? Because the evolution of there's this idea of like the conscious evolution, like the evolution of survival is like, if I'm starving out in the desert and I just find something that has a lot of salt or sugar or fat, then it's best for me to just eat that and just like get that food source and then have those nutrients, because I don't know, in a scarcity environment, I don't know where that is going to come from, right? But the thing is, it's like the whole point is that that's actually this, like, Pluto, it's like this sort of like old instinctual mechanism that is left over from prehistoric times when we were in a much more scarce environment. And then even if in modern times, it's like historically, like, my ancestors were a bunch of poor peasants who had to deal with all sorts of bullshit that would be like, it's also kind of funny if you're at least like a little bit literate and you like read about how people, let's say in the Victorian era or something like that, had to deal with poverty and stuff like that. Like, it's like, why is anybody, it's, I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm just speaking from a place. There's some issue about Western society, or the affluent countries such as America and Canada and all this kind of stuff, where it's like what registers as success or survival or something like that is much more like socially determined, rather than actually having anything to do with having like actual real concrete survival, right? Because it's like it's incredibly difficult to get to the point where you're actually at risk of like not having enough food, or you're gonna freeze to death, or like it takes a lot. It's gonna take a lot to get something, but to be like, oh, I feel like I need to kill myself because I just work a shitty job at McDonald's and I feel I don't have good self-esteem and it makes my life, like, living every day is painful, so I have an addiction, I have to take drugs. Like, that's more of a problem for people. Like, we have a world, like, American economy, the biggest employer is like Walmart and Home Depot, and you probably have a bunch of people who are depressed and don't want to go to their job and have to, like, keep this addiction going, and their own threat to their own survival is whether they overdose on some painkiller, because the whole economy makes them feel miserable, right? And this is the biggest, like, I don't know. I just feel like I don't know, like there's, or that's that kind of thing that like you're going to or like the reason why that the reason for the trade war is like Canadian fentanyl dealers, right? Because the biggest existential crisis isn't actual war or like terrorism or something like that. It's like the fact that your economy is built on a bunch of people who are so miserable and depressed that the biggest threat is like drug dealers selling them painkillers that they might overdose on or become non-functional because of. And that's like, this is our, then you just, in your whole, it's like the crisis of self-esteem where you're just some like, you know, it's some person who has no essential value. You're just another replaceable cog in the wheel of the machine that that you can just easily be, if you don't do a good job, you just be replaced by another cog that does it better than you, right? And that sort of that sense that like everything is disposable and replaceable, and like, you know, out with the old and with the new, and we're all just sort of like it's like this we have to just keep consuming before we start to like become self-aware of our own planned obsolescence, right? That like you could just be some guy who's like, oh, you know, I'm just like a dishwasher that only lasts for 6 years, and now it's time for me to be replaced, and then after that I just live in a scrap heap where nobody cares about me. And that's like, it's not actually that I have any risk of me not being able to survive, but it's just that it's just a miserable, humiliating situation to be in. And that's you know, that's the only issue, right? And we have to live in this sort of land of lost toys and forgotten things that are being in a process of scorpionic decomposition, of elimination and stuff, right? All right, that's my idea for today. Thanks for watching.